Okay, so this is identity and access management for newbies. I'm basically just going to be going over very basic stuff. I'm not going to go in depth with a lot of the things, especially identity and access management related. However, I do like to fall down rabbit holes. So if I do, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I get off track sometimes, but I've got my notes here, so I'll try to stay on track. And funny note, this is not Amazon Web Services related. Someone had asked me, "Oh, you're going to talk about AWS." I was like, "No, this is an entire culture within cybersecurity. It's very small, but it is indeed very important." So those of you who thought this was AWS, I'm sorry, it's not. But for identity and access management, it is the backbone. It's backbone for cybersecurity. It's actually a backbone for your life in general. So I'm going to say this a lot out through here, but get used to saying the word no, because no is very, very important with identity and access. So I'm also posted my slides out there for you guys to use on Discord, and I'll post them out on other resources as well, because I'm going to include wall block what's on the screen. So if you're wondering reading versus listening, I'd do the listening and you can do the reading later. And this will be recorded so you can watch it again at a later time. Okay, so about me, they call me a professional chaos coordinator. That was given to me several years ago and it just kind of stuck. I specialize in healthcare. I've been doing healthcare for about 8-ish years, doing privacy and security. I've been doing security for about the last 3 or 4 years. I turned to the dark side. The only credential I'm going to mention here is I'm a certified access management specialist, or CAMS, certified with the Identity Management Institute. They're a great organization for identity and access management. And I do have a bunch of other healthcare and security certifications to at least prove I'm worth something to human resources. So I won't go over those because I don't like talking about myself. So any other questions you have about where I am, how did I get here, just reach out to me personally. I'm not going to go over my life story. So agenda for today, I'm going to talk about the threat landscape. I'm going to show you some images on where you see identity and access management come in and make a play. We want to understand why it's important and how it really does show in data breaches. People don't realize how much in data breach research and data analytics, identity and access management actually exists. So then we're going to talk about identity management and best practices. And then we're going to do some access management, authentication, authorization, and access controls. I'm going to glance over those a little bit. I could probably do a presentation on every single one of those separately. So again, just covering the basics here. So then we'll do some questions. And just to note, this presentation in any way does not reflect the views or opinions of my employer currently. So the threat landscape, every year Verizon comes out with a data breach investigations report. The one for 2020 has not come out yet. So this is last year's and it's always a year previous. So this technically was 2018, not 2019. And I wanted you guys to take a look at this figure 6. This was pulled directly out of the report. So about 80% over the last, 10-ish years has been external for the most part. However, we're getting a spike in internal. Identity and access management usually has to deal mostly with internal and partner breaches. But if you find something kind of funny, you're looking at this chart and you see how internal and external kind of match each other. And it's very interesting. So there is some external that involves identity and access management. Most of it is internal. So in regards to hacking, the use of stolen creds is number 1. So again, identity is literally your identity as a user within a system. So the use of stolen creds, that no matter where the credentials are stolen from, that's your identity. It's been stolen. The other one that is important is abuse of functionality. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the abuse of your functionality that you use within the system is access related. So that's also very important. And Verizon was actually very surprised this year that most of the hacking was done via use of stolen credentials. That was a new one for them that year. So very important. Misuse is a big one. So that's the malicious or inappropriate use of existing privileges. So again, the first one on that is privilege abuse. That is access management right there. There's data mishandling, unapproved workarounds. I am, unfortunately, it's a fortunate, unfortunate kind of thing, am the queen of unapproved workarounds. They always call me in and say, hey, we have a way to do this. I want you to find an unapproved workaround so we can figure out how we can deny them access to those certain things. I've gotten in trouble in the past for that, and look where I'm at now. I'm in security. So they always bring me in to find unapproved workarounds for them to notate and document on. Knowledge abuse, email misuse, I mean, a lot of those things down on the line can get in there. But again, top 3 or 4 of those are all identity and access management. If you all remember back in 2017, Nuance, their company that makes dictation software, the one you might be most familiar with is Dragon. Healthcare providers use those to dictate. They had an insider misuse hacking attempt, and it shut down Dragon. It shut down all the providers that use Dragon across the nation, probably across the world. I can't remember if any other countries use it, but it shut them down because someone misused their privileges while they were leaving, and it was an insider job. So again, identity and access management is very important, and no one wants to end up like Nuance and have a bunch of doctors mad at them for turning off their dictation services. All right, so identity management. We want to make sure before users can gain access to data within a system, the system must be able to recognize them. They must be saying, yeah, you are you, I can verify that. So the way we maintain data security and integrity within a system starts by assigning that unique identity to every user that needs one. So then identities are then given attributes to describe the users with which they are associated. So that includes things like names, job duties, permission levels, all sorts of things. It is a digital representation of a user within a system. So the identity serves as the first method of proof presented to the system when access is being requested. So you guys are probably very familiar. Usernames are going to be the #1 thing that you're going to use to log into a system and is most easily recognizable. You can use other things, email addresses, and other kind of recognizable identities, but it's usually going to be your usernames or your email address. So in the whole identity field, you have this identity, but we also must pair it with an authentication credential for the full system access to be granted, and we'll get into that in a second. So we want to make sure that we're assigning very specific permissions to each and every identity, and we're going to go over that in a bit. But an example I want to give to you are 2 employees in the same department may share the same job title, but the permissions and controls on their identities will differ from each other depending on what projects they're doing or work that they're finishing on their own. So just because they have the same identity, or I'm not sorry, not the same identity, you don't want the same identity, but they have the same job role and they have the same permissions, some of those controls are going to be different from each other. So again, the most important aspect of identity is determining and assigning a unique identifier. So we want to provide adequate protection against data breaches. We must ensure that the identities of the users within a system are unique and specific. So assignment of the identifiers, they have to be based on a user's duties and the level of access they require. So I like to use a contractor versus employee scenario where you have someone who comes in as a contractor, does some work for you, and you're like, hey, they're doing a fantastic job, let's bring them on as an employee. They have an identity as a contractor, and you want to change their identity to an employee. Now, every system is going to be different, and I'll talk about this in a second, but you, for the most part, want to keep one identity with one person. I mean, it's the same thing with your social security number. You have it from birth to death. So the same thing happens with contractors. You want them to have that same identity from a contractor to an employee, and maybe later on, they go back to a contractor. You want them to keep that same identity. There are exceptions, which we'll go over, but you want to make sure that they keep that same identity throughout their lifetime. So you're going to do, so you're going to collect certain information: last name, first name, middle name, maiden name, address, phone, email, zip code, last 4 social security number, and there's so much more. A lot of people usually use like 4 or 5 identifiers. I prefer to have like 15, so I definitely know who it is I'm talking to, and we can actually verify users that way at a better rate than what you could without. So even in organizations that have high levels of trust between those executives and employees, I want to talk about sharing identities because that has the potential to lead to breaches, and that results from human error or accidental unauthorized activities. So best practices: naming and numbering conventions. Make sure you have policies and procedures. Are you following them for those conventions? Remember the scenario above, we want one identity per user. A word you're going to hear a lot is exceptions. There's always going to be exceptions to identities. There's always going to be exceptions to access management, unfortunately, especially in this day and age. So if there are exceptions to a rule for certain situations where you have a certain naming or numbering convention for contractors versus naming and numbering conventions for employees, that would be an exception. So just be sure that you have policies and procedures in place for those. Do not reuse or reassign identities. No sharing. I kid you not, I see this all the time. I work in healthcare, specialization in healthcare. I see doctors sharing their credentials with nurses all the time, and it's just like a sore point with me. So no sharing credentials, please. Even admin accounts, like I've seen where they give each individual admin an admin account. You don't share one. Make sure you have strong password management policies and procedures, regular auditing and reviewing of identities, onboarding and offboarding procedures. That is the biggest, one of the biggest things. That is where a lot of people, you hear that they were fired or they quit, they still have access to the systems and they can still wreak havoc even after they're gone, because they still have access to the systems because no one has turned off their access. So you see a lot of that actually out in the world. So I have more offboarding procedures than I do onboarding procedures, and that's honestly fair. So, you hear those stories, it's because their access wasn't turned off in time and their offboarding procedure is probably not up to date. So that, just always have policies and procedures in place. Document, document, document. So authentication versus authorization. This is the never-ending cycle of going back and forth and back and forth. It gets overwhelming. So we're going to kind of do authentication versus authorization. Authorization is also known as access controls. So they kind of do the same things, but authentication, authorization, or access, they're very different, but everything interacts with each other. And again, this is a cycle of going back and forth. So authentication, we want to know who you are. We're going to confirm your user identity, and then we're going to verify your user credentials. And this authentication will always occur before authorization. So examples of authentication are going to be your two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, PIN numbers, biometrics, all of that stuff. Authorization, on the other hand, can define what you do. It's specifying your access controls and what you can do in the system. It validates their permissions to certain files or systems, and this will always occur after authentication. Examples of this are RBAC, or role-based access control. We'll talk about that next slide. Permissions, restrictions, things like that. And permissions and restrictions are those, you're giving permission to a folder or restrictions to a particular folder because they don't need access to it. And these are very closely linked, and they actually do sometimes overlap in the flow of access control, which is fine. So when authentication proves the identity of a user, the authorization process initiates to check, again, what access the user should be allowed. This is the point at which the access levels come into play, and it'll dictate how much data is available to the users and what actions they can take based on their identities. So the one I like to use for this is social media. I don't use Facebook. I use Twitter and LinkedIn, and that's pretty much it. But a lot of people use Facebook, so I use this example. So again, Facebook started offering privacy settings for posts and profiles where you can only share posts with friends, or you can share posts with everybody's. So users not included in those predefined groups can't see or interact with posts protected by special permissions. So that's your end user situation there. Most everybody uses Facebook. I don't personally use Facebook, but that's a situation there with authorization authentication. All right, so access controls. There are different protocols that we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the most popular, and one of them is actually the most least popular, but there are several of these. There are very many of these, but I'm only going to go over some of them. So we're just going to go through these. Attribute-based access controls, it's if this, then that rule. It follows a guideline. So it determines whether a user should be allowed to access data or take certain actions, because then it utilizes and then it combines the attributes and rules from across the system. And this one's actually considered the most robust. Discretionary access control, this allows the owner of the data to decide which users are granted access. And it allows administrators to allowing administrators to create a hierarchy within their system. So that's also a pretty popular one. History-based access control isn't very popular. It evaluates past behaviors to determine the likelihood of a user performing malicious activities. And of course, that's not 100% perfect, so not everybody uses history-based. Identity-based access control, that involves basing data access on permissions associated with the unique identities assigned to each user. So you're assigning restrictions and permissions and subjects and objects directly to that identity. So if you have like 50 new hires, you have to go through and do 50 permissions and restrictions for every single one. So last one, role-based access control. This is the most widely used, and it allows access to resource based on the needs of predefined roles. It delivers only the minimum amount of data needed to perform tasks. So this is actually HIPAA approved. This is in the bylaws of HIPAA. They prefer role-based access control. So you have nurses, they have a predefined role. They can do certain things according to their licensure. Then you have physicians. They have certain things they can do according to their licensures. EMTs, schedulers, things like that. You can lump them into roles and then provide access to that roles in these groups. So this is a big one with healthcare because, again, you have all these different roles within healthcare, and a lot of them have licensures and they can only do certain things. So I mostly dabble in role-based access control myself, but these are just mainly the most widely used and the most popular ones, except for history-based. Don't see that one too often. So best practices for access control, you want least privilege and need to know. We only want to grant access to what they need to do to complete their duties, nothing more. If they do need something in additional, that would be considered an exception. And again, that would have to be documented within the system on whatever you're giving them the exception for, or if you use a ticketing system to document in that. So again, document, document, document. We want separation of duties. So this is used if a user has more than one duty, responsibility, or job role. So for example, a nurse that is on the ICU unit has different duties and access than a nurse in the emergency department. So a lot of nurses that do float pools, they'll have different separations of duties. They'll have different templates for their access. They'll have one identity, but they'll have multiple separation of duties for best practices. And again, those need to be documented because it is an exception. So finally, advice you need. This is going in from someone who went into security with hardly any knowledge. I had great leaders, I had great mentors, I still do, but this is for you guys. This is stuff I wish I would have known going in. So you will have to stand up to end users, unfortunately. It happens. You don't be afraid to say no, because saying no before saying yes is more well received than saying yes before saying no. I've done this plenty of times. I'll tell a physician, oh yeah, we can do that, that's no big deal. And then I'll come back and say, sorry, we were wrong. And they're not gonna like that over being told, no, I can't do that right now, but let me check on it. And then I can come back and say, no, we can't, or yes, we can. They're gonna respond better to no first than yes. I'll just tell you that right now. So again, don't be afraid to say no, it's perfectly fine. Critical thinking is an absolute must. We always must look at every single angle to get a complete perspective from everything, because we're not just looking at what they can do, but we're looking again at those possible workarounds that they could do, that they could wreak havoc on. So again, critical thinking is a must. And my last one, which I've mentioned, you will always want to document everything. Write it down, ticket system, in the system, I mean, whatever, just document it, especially exceptions. Always have a policy and procedure in place for every exception that you do. And I found this quote, I was watching Outlander, and one of the characters, Gayla, says this, and she says, don't stop asking the hard questions. That's the way the world changes. And I relate so much to this because anytime I'm working with my team, we're always asking each other questions, because they may be thinking of a question that I didn't think of, so always, always, always ask questions. And I also want to give a big thank you to the Identity Management Institute. I'm very picky with my professional organizations. So they are a great resource for identity and access management. Again, they have great certifications. They just haven't they have a great blog. They're amazing. I can't talk about them enough. So a big thank you to them. And I guess it's question time. I have my Twitter and my LinkedIn, and I also posted this from Twitter from the lovely Casey, because the tech world is united by things we've all done wrong before.
Thank you so much. If there's any questions, please post them. Sometimes it can take a little bit of time for questions to come in because there's a little bit of a delay. Um, I thought that was such an interesting talk. I love how you had the emphasis of authentication versus authorization. I think that that's
Mhm.
such an important thing to distinguish between. And I also have to say personally, I loved the emphasis on documentation, but that's
Yeah,
just
any
a
coder or programmer will tell you the same thing. Document. But yeah, I mean, like half of my day is literally just writing down what I've done, because if I don't, I'm not going to remember, of course. But then, someone actually told me this recently: you're making a mistake right now and you don't even know it. So if I find a mistake in the system that someone made, 3-4 years ago, that person made a mistake right then. And so if they have the documentation to support why they did it, I can understand that. But
yeah.
again, we all make mistakes every day. And as long as you have the documentation to support it, we can understand your point of view.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So it looks like we do have a question from Discord. The question is there any resources to help us lab this or develop these skills?
Absolutely. So virtual labs are an option. You can Twitter me or send me a message on LinkedIn and I can get you more information. I work with, on Twitter, we talk a lot, and I'm going to butcher his name. I'm not going to even try, but he actually does have a virtual lab. He works in Active Directory, which is a, identity and access management platform, so to speak. But yeah, he's done virtual labs and it's an amazing process. I've actually been wanting to do one myself, but we moved last year and we're still trying to we're still unpacking boxes, honestly. So, and I'm like, oh, right now, I'm still working on site at hospitals. So during this crisis, so I haven't gotten a chance to learn any new crafts, but that's one thing. Yeah, you can do a virtual lab and I will definitely get some information for you guys if you are interested. And let me talk to my friend about it because he actually has one. So that you absolutely can learn these skills. I do have a couple more resources that I can also post on my Twitter for you guys to use, just websites in general, self-learning, things like that. But virtual lab is probably the best case, and it's actually quite, on the cheaper side compared to, like penetration testing and things like that. So, but yeah, just if you have any, I'll get those together and I'll post them out there. Just be sure to follow me or add me on LinkedIn and we can keep in touch. Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so the next question that we have is how do you manage, retain the documentation?
Good question. So it really depends on what kind of systems you're using. I will say number one, try to keep it in a ticketing system. So if you work tickets in a queue through a ticketing system, document it in there. I usually do it that way, or I keep my own separate log, password protected, on the server that, just I don't put any identity information in there, but I'll say I did this and that. But for example, one of the systems I specialize in called Epic, they have a huge area for notes, and that's where we document anything that we've done. So it really depends on what kind of system you're using or what kind of application, because some of those applications do have areas where you can write down those exceptions. But the number one thing that we usually do it in is our ticketing system. And if your team doesn't actually get tickets and it's more based off of onboarding and offboarding, I would go ahead and just start ask for a ticket queue and be like, hey, we just want to keep track of these ourselves. And so that way you have something to refer back to if you ever get audited.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, let's see. I don't see any other questions. Okay, thank you so much for the presentation today. I really enjoyed listening to it. I
Yeah,
really
no
look forward
problem.
to following you on Twitter to get some of the resources and stuff, because I think that's going to be really exciting, especially about the labs.
I know, I'll probably start mine this next week and you guys can follow me as I do it.
That will be awesome.
So
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me. Everybody have a great, fantastic day. Stay safe and keep learning. That's all I'm going to say. Soak up that knowledge like a sponge.